Friends, I must tell you first of all about some things that happened to me. I was preaching not very long ago, and I noticed down in the front pew a mother with a 3 or 4-year-old boy, and she was trying to keep him very quiet. But after I had talked for 15 minutes that must have seemed 15 hours to him, he tugged at his mother's sleeve, and he says, "Mommy, is it really that hard to get to heaven?"
Travel along, Catholic pilgrims, for 1 year as we learn from Venerable Fulton Sheen, one of the greatest Catholic teachers in modern times. Join me, Amy Thomas, once a week for a short reading out of Bishop Sheen's book, Way to Inner Peace. Hey, Catholic pilgrims, welcome to week 18. This is our last reading in the little section devoted to happiness. And Bishop Sheen, he constantly is throwing names out at us, and I feel like such a dummy sometimes as I'm reading through the readings, because I'm like, oh, who is this person? He talks about him like everybody who is reading this or listening to him knows exactly who he's talking about. And some of the names, like I vaguely know them, but I don't know them the way he does. And so for a lot of these readings, I have to go do some research in order to prepare for my podcast so I can talk to you guys about who these people are and different things like that. So if as we're reading through it, you're like, man, I don't know any of these names, you're not alone. I don't know most of them either, and I have to go do some heavy research. But I wanted to remind you, as we're going through these readings, there might be the tendency as I read through these to apply these lessons to other people. And what I mean by that is there might be the tendency to say, oh, yes, I see these actions or these attitudes in these other people. And the important thing to remember is we're reading through this because we want to improve ourselves and we want to find inner peace in our lives. And it all starts with us. And so it can be helpful sometimes if we notice it in other people to use that as a story or an analogy. But ultimately, as we're reading through these readings, think about yourself and check yourself. Do an examination of conscience. Is this something that I struggle with? And is this an area where I can improve? And that is the goal of this whole year, is to find that inner peace within ourselves. And once we find it within ourselves, it helps us to, go out into the world and bring that light of Christ and to help other people find that inner peace. So this week we are talking about the fault is in ourselves. And the 3 points to think about are Reformation, conscience, and restoration. Number 18, the fault is in ourselves. Politics is what might be called deferred repentance, the keeping clean of the outside of the cup in order to escape the necessity of cleaning the inside. The great appeal of so many modern political philosophies is that they make all the evils of the world economic, and thus dispense its victims from the need of moral betterment. There's more fun in pointing out the splinter in another's eye than in the picking the girder out of one's own. Those ages which have an inordinate interest in the reformation of society are often those who are most heedless of the reformation of the individual. That group of educators who say that evil is non-existent and that there are only complexes are like those who say that there are no diseases in the body, but only imaginations. The fact is that every person can be egotistic and selfish, and in such a case, there is no one except himself to blame. It is not just the desire for economic well-being or for security that makes a person antisocial. It is most often his desire to have his own way, come what may. Hilary Belloc told the story of a man trundling a large vat of wine on a cart. And as he passed through one village after another, he haggled with prospective purchasers about the price. In the end, he hands out the drink to everyone for nothing. It was not so much gain he wanted, it was his own way. In the parable of the prodigal son, the son broke first with his father in his heart, and then wanted the division of goods. The economic division was merely a consequence of the alienation of his heart from his father. The full economic life is no barrier to a break with the tradition of home, country, and religion. Sometimes the abundance of the material leads men to believe that happiness is to be found without rather than within. The prodigal son, after suffering from a famine in a foreign country, was restored to a sense of values when he came to himself. That reality broke in upon him. He saw that nothing outside, but something inside himself was the root of all his troubles. But here is an absorbing psychological fact. When an egotist begins to see that he is to blame for his condition, there is apt to be a moment which exasperates him into open rebellion. At this stage, the egotist is not immoral in action, he is anti-moral and anti-religious in his attitudes, words, and thoughts. Shame and a false remorse have maddened him to a moral Laocoon stung into a living martyrdom by the serpents in his bosom. Much of the bigotry and the attacks hurled against decency by exhausted libertines spring from the soul's first passionate recoil against detected criminality, discovered viciousness, or stained honor. The intolerable anguish of a wounded egotist in which he is whipped, not by whips, but by scorpions, prompts him to attacks on morality, from which before conscience began whipping him, he would have shrunk with horror. Perhaps if we understood human nature better, we would see that those who hate goodness and decency violently are also those who hate themselves more. They relieve for a time the pressure for interior reformation and compensate for it by outrages against that which they know to be true but refuse to embrace. For the same reason, those who are filled with hate and are anti-God may be closer to genuine piety than those of our modern Western world who are neither hot nor cold, and therefore will be vomited from the mouth of God. Few hells are deeper than when a disillusioned egotist and an evil conscience boil together in the same cauldron. One of the classic stories of antiquity is Circe, who transformed human beings into swine or lowered humanity into the state of brute beasts. Circe today parades under the name of a psychology which reduces the human being to an animal. But there was also a Ulysses who compelled the enchantress to restore his companions into that former shape. Our world of education and psychology needs someone to do that, to make us conscious of our true identity, to restore the egotist to sanity. This is the grace of Christ, which brings prodigals from the pigsty back to the Father's house. So if you're like me, this first reading through, today's readings can kind of be a little overwhelming. There's so much packed into what he is saying in just about 3 pages, I think, that it's dense, right? And so there's a lot to go over here. And so I thought that's what we would do today, because it took at least 4 readings for me to really start to soak in what he was saying. And sometimes that's what we have to do when we read through stuff. We just have to read it, put it down. We're like, wow, I didn't get anything out of that. And then come back to it, read it again. The second time through, you're going to get a little bit more. And then again and again sometimes. It's totally fine to do that. And I would encourage you to do that. We do it with the Bible. We read the same things over and over again. And each time we get a little bit more, or we see things in a different light. And so it's fine that we have to do that. But I'm sure if you're listening to this and you don't even have the book in front of you, you may be like, wow, what did we just read? So I just want to walk through the readings today because while they are dense, it's packed with a lot of good things for us to think about. So let's start at the beginning. He says, the great appeal of so many modern political philosophies is that they make all the evils of the world economic, and thus dispense its victims from the need of moral betterment. And I even had to ask my husband, I'm like, what in the world is he saying? Because he's kind of talking in a way that we don't really talk anymore, where he says they make all the evils of the world economic. That just is kind of worded differently than maybe how we would speak today. So what he's saying here is we've taken morality out of things and we just make everything about economics. Oh, you're acting this way because you're poor, because you don't have a lot of money, or because, you don't have a lot of material items, or maybe because you don't have, a 4-year degree. That's why you're acting this way. It doesn't have anything to do with morals. It has everything to do with your economic state. Or you don't understand anybody else because you have so much money and you have everything that you could ever want. This in some way makes you out of touch with people. You don't understand. So, it's all boiled down to you're acting this way because you're rich, or you're acting this way because you're poor. We tend to put the moral bent on the wealthier people a little bit more. But for the most part, we try to sort of rationalize bad behavior based off of your economic state instead of morality and appealing to God's moral law and things like that. And so that's what he's talking about here at the very beginning. And I hope that kind of clears that up for you. And then he goes on to say there is more fun in pointing out the splinter in another's eye than in picking out the girder out of one's own. And that comes straight out of the Bible. Christ talked about that. Take the beam out of your own eye before you go and get the splinter out of your brother's eye. He says, those ages which have an inordinate interest in the reformation of society are often those who are most heedless of the reformation of the individual. And I think this is a very important point to focus on, because so often what people are worried about is fixing things out in the world. And that's not wrong in and of itself, but we become so focused on fixing all the things out in the world. We got to reform this, we got to reform that, we got to reform this institution over here, we got to reform, this policy or this law or something. How often, though, are people saying, I need to reform myself? I need to reform myself. Or to add to that, just we're very interested in reforming other people, but very rarely do we look at ourselves and say, no, it all starts with me. I have to look at my life and see where I can become a better Christian, a better citizen. I need to look at myself. It's the only thing I can control. The only person I can really control is myself. Now, it's not bad to go out and try to reform, things that need reforming, but that's often our only focus. And a lot of times it has to do with pride, because one, we want to do something big where everybody sees it, and two, we don't want to look at ourselves, so it's easier to look outwardly. Moving down into the next paragraph, he talks about Hilaire Belloc. Now, Hilaire Belloc was a writer. He was a poet and a writer who was Catholic. And I have read some of his poems, and they're very good. And his Catholic faith really influenced a lot of his writing. So that's who he's talking about right here. But he says that there's the story of a man trundling a large vat of wine on a cart, and as he passed through one village after another, he haggled with prospective purchasers about the price, and in the end he hands out the drink to everyone for nothing. It was not so much gain he wanted, it was his own way. And so reading through the story, you're like, what is going on here? But what it shows is that the man really did want his own way. He's going through town with his wine, and people are like, hey, I'll pay you $5 for some wine. He's like, no, I want $7. And then they're like, what about $6.50? And he's like, no, I want $6.75. And they're like, well, I can't pay that. And so then he just gives it to them because he wants to do it. He wants his own way, when he could have taken the $5 or the $6.50, but he didn't want to give them the satisfaction of haggling a price that he would agree to. So apply this, to our lives in a bigger picture type of way. This is just a story that's used to kind of metaphorically show how we go about our lives. We argue with people, we try to press our own way. Sometimes people come to us and are trying to compromise with us on something that can be compromised on, and we refuse to listen. We don't want to hear anything they have to say. We refuse to meet them halfway on anything because we want our way. And so in the end, we do it our way, even though it gets us nothing. Like the guy, he gets nothing for his wine, but he did it his way. You can hear Frank Sinatra in the background, right? Let's continue on. Now, Bishop Sheen obviously loved the parable of the prodigal son. I think he's used it maybe like 4 times in these writings that we've read through already. So he obviously got a lot out of this parable. And it's one of the best. It really is, because I think we can relate to, all parts of the story of the prodigal son. But I love what he points out here at the beginning. He says, in the parable of the prodigal son, the son broke first with his father in his heart, and then he wanted the division of goods. And that's so true. I have never actually thought about that before. The son did. He broke with his dad in his heart, and he's like, I don't want to be around you. I honestly wish you were dead so that I can have my own way. Since you're not dead, and I've now broken with you in my heart, can I just have my inheritance now? And then he says the economic division was merely a consequence of the alienation of his heart from his father. And this next line is something that, I think we need to talk about. He says the full economic life is no barrier to a break with the tradition of home, country, and religion. What he means by that is if you have a full life, you have all your material needs met, you can even purchase anything you want, you have degrees, you have a job, you have a car, you have a house, you have vacations, all of those things, those aren't barriers to you breaking in your heart with your home. Those things don't hold a family together, with your country and with your religion. In fact, Bishop Sheen goes on to say, sometimes the abundance of the material leads men to believe that happiness is to be found without rather than within. And that's what the son thought. He thought, I'll go find happiness with this material gain, this new economic life that I found. I'll go find all the happiness that I want. And we know that that is not what brings him true happiness. And so he realizes that, and Bishop Sheen continues on. The prodigal son, after suffering from a famine, was restored to a sense of values when he came to himself. That reality broke in upon him. He saw that nothing outside, but something inside himself was the root of his troubles. He realized that, no, it's not my dad. It's not the wealth. It's none of that. It's me. I'm the problem. And there can be 2 reactions to this. And Bishop Sheen touches on the very negative one, which is, and he says, here's the absorbing psychological fact. When an egotist begins to see that he is to blame for his condition, there is apt to be a moment which exasperates him into open rebellion. Now, the prodigal son didn't go into open rebellion, but so many of us do when we face ourselves. This is what happened to the prodigal son. There in the pigsty, when he's hungry and he's thinking of his father and he's thinking of home, he realizes that this is his fault. And he accepts that. And he knows what he needs to do to fix it. He doesn't go into open rebellion. He does what you're supposed to do and go back to the Father. But so many of us, when we're faced with ourselves, there's a moment where we're like overcome, like he says, exasperated by who we are and what we've become. And we see ourselves for who we truly are, but we don't want to see it. And so we go into open rebellion. Like he says, we become almost anti-moral. It's like we go completely the opposite way. We're not going to face ourselves. No. And in fact, I'm going to go even further down the path away from God because we're so scared of facing ourselves and accepting that the fault lies with us. And why that is so hard for us as human beings to accept is almost a mystery, but it really is. We have a hard time accepting that we may be to blame. Just think of how hard it is to say you're sorry. We can barely do that. He goes on to say, much of the bigotry and the attacks hurled against decency by exhausted libertines spring from the soul's first passionate recoil against detected criminality, discovered viciousness, or stained honor. What does he mean here? Let's take this sentence apart. So this is the rebellion. A libertine is somebody who's been way free with their moral life. Like they just do whatever they want. They're exhausted. They've come face to face with the fact that their life is going down the tubes because of themselves, because of the path that they have chosen to walk down. Nobody else is to blame. And so they go into open rebellion. And so they just start spewing bigotry and they hurl attacks at the moral life, at decency, because they have to attack that which they have failed to live up to. And so they're going to try to tear it down to show it as being, untrue or a false way of living. And the reason why is because they have uncovered, like he says, this is their passionate recoil at discovering criminality in their hearts. They've looked and they've discovered viciousness or honor that is actually stained. And they don't want to see that. We don't want to see those things. And so we lash out like, almost like a rabid tigers. It's crazy. Moving down the page a little bit, he says, perhaps if we understood human nature better, we would see that those who hate goodness and decency violently are also those who hate themselves more. They relieve for a time the pressure for interior reformation and compensate for it by outrages against that which they know to be true. So this is important. The person who is in open rebellion, who has faced themselves, they know that decency and God's moral laws are true. They know it. Deep down, they know it. There's so many times when we see people and we're like, how can they not know that that's wrong? No, they know it. They know it. They're just in open rebellion. And they're doing exactly what he says. They hate goodness and decency violently because they don't like themselves. Because honestly, even when we don't face ourselves and we don't want to see what's really going on in our souls or in our minds, we do know. We do know deep, deep down in our minds. We actually do know. And because we do know, we don't like ourselves. And you can see it written all over people's faces when they are in this open rebellion. They commit outrages all the time. They're blasphemous against God. And we see it, and we see that they don't like themselves because they are not people that have an inner peace. They do not have joy. They do not exude joy in any way. We can see it in their physical features. They can almost be hard to look at because you can see that hate displayed on their face, and it's hard to look at that. And then he says, for the same reason, those who are filled with hate and are anti-God may be closer to genuine piety than those of our modern Western world who are neither hot nor cold, and therefore will be vomited from the mouth of God. Why does he say this? The reason he says this is because, people who are just lukewarm, just kind of indifferent, don't really care, the neither hot nor cold, they're not even taking the time to think about it. They're just completely indifferent about it. But those who are like in open rebellion, who are fighting against God, they're fighting against morals, they're fighting against everything, they're closer to piety because they know that they're in the wrong and they're fighting against it. And they're trying to push God back because they're scared of what will happen if they do face themselves and do try to reform their lives. And so here at the very end, Bishop Sheen gives us this story of Ulysses and Circe was an enchantress, and she changed all of Ulysses' men into swines, and they were just brute beasts. And that's what living an immoral life and hating ourselves can lead us to. We kind of are like I said, rabid tigers. We're just beasts. We have lost our humanity when we don't live moral lives. And so then Ulysses, he's compelled to ask this enchantress to restore his companions to their former shape, to their former humanity. And then Bishop Sheen says, but we need somebody who can remind us, to make us conscious of our true identity, to restore the egotist to sanity. And this last line is so beautiful. This is the grace of Christ which brings prodigals from the pigsty back to the Father's house. So that's how we get true restoration and reformation in our lives, is through Christ. You know, it is hard when you've done something terrible, when you've been living a very immoral life, to go to confession, to face yourself in, a spiritual mirror, and to see what you have allowed yourself to become. But we cannot have inner peace in our lives, and we cannot have true happiness unless and until we do face ourselves. And it may lead us into open rebellion. And we will be so disheartened by what we see in ourselves. But the beautiful thing is that Christ, in that moment, can give us the grace to rise out of it. When our conscience has been pricked, and we know that this is not the right way. We may rebel against it, but we know it's not the right way. That grace that we can receive can make all the difference in the world. And we can restore ourselves to that person that, God made us to be, or at least we can start getting on the path to that person who God made us to be. And that will bring about so much inner peace and so much happiness. So that is all for this week, Catholic Pilgrims. I will see you back here for week 19 when we start a new little section. I think it's called External Influences. And if I could ask a favor, if you are enjoying this podcast, if you wouldn't mind leaving me a rating, a review on the platform that you listen to this podcast on, I would greatly appreciate it. It will help press it out to other people so that they can see it, and it just would mean a lot to me. And so please do that if you are so inclined. I thank you in advance. And until next time, Catholic Pilgrims, live the faith boldly and travel well.